You're listening to the Hazard Ground Podcast, with service members from across the military sharing their stories of combat and survival. And now, here's your host, Mark Zeno.
Welcome into the Hazard Ground Podcast. This week's guest is one of our very special guests simply because of the foundation that he has started, and we will get to that in just a moment. But after graduating from West Point, he spent 13 years on active duty, including 3 deployments to Iraq and Afghanistan. Not only that, he founded RWB, Red, White, and Blue, the organization that helps support wounded veterans all across the country. He is Mike Erwin on the Hazard Ground Podcast. Mike, welcome. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much. Really honored to be here and excited to talk.
Yeah, listen, the organization is fantastic. There is no doubt about it. I myself have signed up. I have my Eagles shirt. We will get into all of that coming up later on. And a lot of people may have seen the red shirt with the eagle wings on it, RWB, as it's more commonly known. But before we get to RWB, tell us how your military career got started.
Absolutely. So, I started, neither of my parents went to college. They were both police officers. My mom was actually the first woman police officer on the Syracuse Police Department back in 1974. And when it came time to go to college, at the last minute, in my sophomore year, I started to look at West Point. And it was about a 4-hour drive from Syracuse, New York, where I was from, and came down here, and that's actually where I'm talking to you from today. It's just this beautiful place, sits on the Hudson River, and I was enthralled by what I learned and what I saw. And I knew that I had to at least give it a shot and try to get in. And once I got in, then I knew that I had to go and at least give it a shot. And, it obviously transformed my life. September 11th happened at the start of my senior year. So I was planning on just doing 5 years in the military that I would owe and move on. But 9/11 took place, and I branched military intelligence, and I went on to obviously have a very different military career than I would have, say 10 years prior. So I went to Fort Hood, Texas, and then I went to 3rd Special Forces Group in Fort Bragg, where I was an intelligence officer in support of infantry and SF units. And so that was the journey that brought me from, a kid from Syracuse, New York, to joining the military, to then staying, even when I didn't expect that I would be there that long.
Go back to the day that 9/11 happened when you were at West Point. I mean, it's a normal day. You're going through your normal cadet kind of rigmarole, if you will, and it all happens. What were your professors, who were obviously, coincidentally, for those who don't know, they're all military people as well, too. They've all been serving for years, and a lot of majors and lieutenant colonels who are teachers there at West Point. The towers are falling, the world is changing, and what are they telling you?
Oh, it was incredible. And the scary thing is it feels like it was just yesterday. I'm literally right here on the grounds of West Point, where I was when I learned, about the attacks. And actually the night before, September 10th, I was down in New York City. I played baseball here at West Point, and I was down there to watch the New York Yankees play the night before. And it was just, I remember crossing over the GW Bridge, George Washington Bridge, at around 9 o'clock at night, seeing the Twin Towers, way down at the end of Manhattan in the distance. And just remember thinking to myself, just what an amazing city this is. And so, less than 10 hours later to hear about the attacks, my brother was actually a cadet at West Point, same time as me. And he called me when it happened and said, "Hey, turn on the news." The whole place was in an immediate state of panic, just because of how close we were to New York City, 40 miles away, 40 miles north on the Hudson River. And so there was an immediate, threat concern of like, geez, what might be happening here? We're a target ourselves because we've got 4,000 future Army officers in one location. And then there became just the realization that this was a terrorist attack and that it was going to really change the trajectory of our careers. So there was, as you might imagine, a ton of nervous energy around here. And again, just feels like it was yesterday in many ways.
It's interesting. I'm a native New Yorker. I grew up in Long Island, as many people on the podcast have heard me talk about. And I remember 9/11 myself, too. And I never remember thinking that, oh, my God, we're going to war. And maybe it's just because I was so worried about family and friends and everybody I knew who was in Manhattan and that day. But was that the thought process? Was that what professors were telling you? Guys, we're going to war? And what was that like hearing it?
Yeah, it actually was. And I'll never forget the first person who really made it clear to us that was happening was General retired Barry McCaffrey. I had him as one of my professors, and he had already kind of said, hey, well, not only are we going to figure out like where this came from and there, but there's also immediately he knew that there was going to be some sort of effect with Iraq because of the fact that, the problems from the Middle East, the instability, and how much Saddam had been essentially, refuting the world and the United Nations and all that. So we heard from some of our professors really long before we were even hearing it from the mainstream media that this was such an egregious attack that we would undoubtedly, as we commissioned in the coming years, be lieutenants serving in combat. And of course, we believed it immediately, just because we were hearing it from some of our professors. And yeah, it definitely was, as you might imagine, from just the 2 days earlier, thinking that the most dangerous assignment we might have would be Korea, or maybe Bosnia, Kosovo, to now thinking about the unknowns of what combat might look like in the Middle East. So it was definitely grabbed everybody's attention anytime any professor would talk about it.
When you're at West Point, there's a whole lot of testosterone running around. It's just the nature of the beast. And we see all these war movies where guys find out, a unit finds out that they're going, and they all jump up and scream, and it's like, yeah, this is great, and they get all excited. Was anybody expressing those kind of emotions on that day?
No, definitely not. Yeah, I mean, it was very somber. We had a few cadets who lost a brother or lost a father because, the Pentagon was attacked, as we know, and that. So we had some classmates here who lost very close family members or friends, and people like you who were living, and had family in Long Island or in New York City. So very much it was somber and reflective for a while. I'd say that attitude and that mindset of like, hey, I'm ready to go. Like, I want to go do my part, and I want to help, to bring justice to people who did this to our country. Those feelings started to emerge a couple of weeks later, but it took a little while, certainly, for the shock and also the sadness, with those, that we were classmates with, before those feelings, I think, started to set in.
Well, my next question was, what was it like at graduation then? Were people expressing the hype of, yeah, we're going to war kind of deal?
Oh, yeah. I mean, so, we had that year, we had President Bush, who was our commencement speaker, and he sort of laid out the case for why, we needed to bring more of a military effort to the Middle East, in the coming years. And he kind of explained, in his thought process and the cabinet's thought process was that, the conditions in the Middle East had set the stage for the breeding and the growth of Al-Qaeda. And he laid that out. And, really prior to that, when cadets came time to select their branches, typically, before 2001, the infantry branch at West Point was one of the last branches to be filled. It was, one of the ones where some of the lowest ranking cadets would go.
Yep.
After 9/11, it became such a popular branch that West Point had to go reach out to the Army and request, I believe, an additional 80 or 90 slots to make sure that every graduate, or as many graduating officers that had infantry as their first choice, were commissioned as infantry officers. So there was definitely a very strong desire for a lot of graduates to serve and to be on the front line.
Yeah, for those of you who don't know, when the Army goes through its whole accessions process, there are three ways you get commissioned. You can go through West Point, you can go through ROTC, or you can go through OCS, Officer Commissioning School, and get it that way. But the West Point cadets always get their first choice because you guys are, supposed to be the cream of the crop, and I say that as an ROTC guy defending the rest of the ROTC fellows out there. But so I think that's interesting to know that they actually they went to that length to get all the West Point guys infantry slots. Now, for those listening as well, it's not like you graduated from West Point, war's already started, and they send you right off, because there's a whole bunch of schooling and everything you have to go through. So a lot of time has elapsed. Now, it's June of 2002 or May of 2002, whatever it was, when you actually graduated, got commissioned. At that point in time, you have to go to your basic course and so on and so forth. So when do you actually get to a unit that's going down range?
Yeah, it's close to, for infantry, because they go to Ranger School and all that, it's close to a year. It's about 10 months. So we graduated on June 1st, 2002, and some of those lieutenants were showing up in March and April to their units. Now because I was an intelligence officer, I showed up in November of 2002. So I was showing up, about 5 months after graduation, because my training process was shorter than it was for infantry officers, who, again, showed up in the spring of 2003. Just in time for the beginnings of the invasion of Iraq.
Just out of curiosity, why military intelligence? Was that what you always wanted to do?
No, a lot of me wanted to do artillery, but I ended up going intelligence because of what transpired and what I was learning about in classes at West Point, and that essentially that we knew that this was, to some extent, an intelligence failure, and that in many ways in the coming years, the missions were going to really require effective intelligence to be able to be successful. And so I wanted to really be a part, of helping to analyze and to collect the intelligence to help to make sure that we were making the right calls, making the right decisions on the battlefield.
It's pretty incredible foresight when you think about it. I mean, just because for somebody who deployed, I never realized how much the intelligence needed, work and refining. It was a constant 24-hour mission that never let up for the entire time there. And everything military intelligence folks did was so critical to our success because we don't have people to go capture. We don't have bad guys to go get unless we have the intelligence on where they are and what they're doing. So it was a huge part of the
Absolutely.
effort that made us successful. So when you finally get to your unit, your first duty station, where is it? What are you told? What are your expectations?
Yeah, so I showed up in November of 2002 to Fort Hood, Texas. I was an infantry battalion intelligence officer. And we really thought that we knew that the invasion of Iraq was coming sometime soon, and we thought that we'd be a part of it. But when Turkey changed the plans and they told the 4th Infantry Division that they could not come in from the north, that then canceled our deployment orders. So we ended up not deploying. I deployed on St. Patrick's Day of 2004. So I spent about 16 months in the States watching a lot of my friends deploy. A lot of my friends in those early days, when the violence wasn't too bad relative to what it became.
Right, yeah.
And I, again, we just spent time training and getting ready to go, and again, deployed on St. Patrick's Day 2004. And then we ended up pushing to Camp Taji, just north of Baghdad.
Yep.
And, and that's really when the insurgency really started to take off, was the spring of 2004. You had that Iranian influence pushing in. You had some of the Saddam loyalists getting to a point where they were really starting to get good and unload their stockpiles and caches of ammunition that they had hidden. And it became a pretty violent place just as we were getting into theater. All the roads in and around Baghdad, then also the indirect fire that we started to take on a lot of our bases. On our base alone, I think we had 9 killed in action in April and May of 2004 from indirect fire alone.
Wow.
So, we got there and it was pretty hot from the time we got there on the ground to, throughout our entire rotation as the insurgency was starting to pick up steam and confidence and momentum.
It's interesting. You're one of the first people that we've talked to. Usually a lot of the guys that we talk to are guys who are out there kicking down doors, pulling triggers, and putting handcuffs on bad guys. I assume as an MI guy that wasn't your main role. Most of your work was done behind a desk, unless you were doing human
behind a computer.
Right, behind
Absolutely.
a computer. Unless you were doing human intelligence, which you were on the ground. So forgive me for not knowing the nitty-gritty of everything, but you said as you were behind a computer, what is that view like of combat? Because, I have a first-hand experience view of combat when bullets are flying. I don't have a view of... It's a 30,000-foot view, but it's also a lot closer than that. I guess you get them both.
Sure. Yeah, so I'd say, so I did do some human intelligence and reporting with meeting informants who would come in and talk about what was going on. So I did do some of that. I did occasionally get out on patrols with some of our units, one to show that I wanted to be out there sharing some of the risks that they were experiencing every day. And so I went about every 3 weeks or so, I would go out on patrol. But ultimately, majority of my time was spent behind a laptop where I was analyzing reports and thinking hard about what the insurgency was doing and what I thought that they were going to do next. The job of an intelligence officer at the tactical level is to predict what the insurgency or the enemy is going to do next, to predict where they're going to attack, where they're going to store their weapons and ammunition, where they're going to meet. And a lot of that you can only do through the combination of reporting and thinking hard about where do you think, based on the knowledge that you have, that they're going to meet, that they're going to go to, that they're going to attack. And so, while I was not obviously being shot at and not being blown up, certainly I knew all the people who were, and that made it very personal to me. And beyond that was the fact that I was ultimately personally responsible, for the successes and the failures that a lot of our guys had. At least I felt that way because I was the one giving them information about the route. And, hey, I think that you might want to be very careful when you get to this culvert or when you get to this location on Route Tampa, or when you get near this village, expect, some potential, small arms fire from the south side of the road, or whatever it was. It was ultimately, something that I felt responsible. But if I had not prepared them to expect it and it happened, I felt that, I had fallen short on my duties. So because of that, it is a different experience, certainly, of combat than being on the ground. And in many ways, it's more psychologically gut-wrenching when you make mistakes knowing that you're not on the ground.
And it's interesting because that's kind of where I was going next. And oh, by the way, good old Route Tampa. For those listening, Route Tampa was like, for those on the East Coast, it's I-95 going through Baghdad. And for those on the West Coast, it would be I-5. But it was the main road that ran all the way from down the border to Kuwait all the way up to Mosul in the north and the border on Iran and Syria. Anyway, but what was it like for you making the decision to tell a unit, an infantry unit, an SF unit, whatever it is, this is the guy you have to go get, and this is where he is? How much information went into that, and how hard sometimes was that decision to make?
Yeah, very difficult because, for us, when I was, and this is different when I was in Afghanistan, when I was, serving and supporting Green Berets, I had access to a lot more intelligence there in that role. But when I was in Iraq in 04 and 05, I had much less information. I saw a much more tactical picture. And so there was very little that I was extremely confident in. And so a lot of times when I made decisions and recommendations about, hey, this is the village or this is the house that you need to hit in the village because this is where we believe the ammunition is being stored that is firing mortars and rockets on our base and killing people and disrupting our aircraft. It was never like very, very clear. It was something that there was a whole bunch of ambiguity. And, I kind of liken being an intelligence officer to like baseball. If you are right 30% of the time, you're doing pretty well. And that obviously doesn't change the fact that when you're wrong, that, it's not that you got out, but that, perhaps people have been killed. So it's a very, very different feeling. And I would say that, it's one that comes with, a lot of pressure that I certainly put on myself as an intelligence officer to do my best and to make sure that I made that when those, our units left the base and they went on patrol, that they had access to what I believe to be the most thoroughly thought through assessment of where they were going.
Was there a decision that you can recall that you made that went wrong that you still carry with you?
Oh yeah, for sure. The big ones are certainly in Afghanistan. There was some assessments that I made there about some particular villages that I assessed to be rather peaceful when they turned out not to be. When it was in Iraq, I think that the biggest, threats were when we went down and we fought in the Battle in the Jaf in August of 2004, and we supported the Marines. There was a couple of locations where, we were taking consistent fire from that, that some of our, vehicles got pinned down a lot, where, I was completely not expecting some of those locations. But ultimately, majority of the places where our troops were either killed or wounded were places where we knew going in that those were difficult locations to be. But certainly anytime, someone was wounded or killed, it was something that still sticks with you to this day.
Did anybody ever come up to you and be like, how did you miss that? How did you not know that? Or did they just all, reconcile the fact that, it's combat and so you can't plan for everything?
Yeah, for the most part, because I had great relationships with our platoon leaders and our company commanders and SF team leaders, that, they understood that, it's a volatile, asymmetric battlefield. And because of that, inherently it's complex and difficult to be able to predict with great clarity. So no, I never got that from anybody, either in email or in person. I think that was probably something I put more on myself. But ultimately, no, because they understood the fact that it's an asymmetric battlefield. So,
and just for clarification, it's not like it's based off, the decision is based off of the intelligence that you have alone. You work with a team of people who all provide you with that. So then the question trickles down. Did you ever say to anybody on your staff, how did you miss that? We just lost guys because this was your sector, your area, and you didn't get it right.
Yeah, I think that, there was probably some times when I thought that, but I never verbalized it. And at the end of the day, as the leader, you're ultimately the one responsible. So even if, there were some instances when some of my analysts missed some data or missed some input, at the end of the day, I'm still the one who is responsible. And I never really think it's effective leadership to outsource failure. And for me, that meant owning the blame and owning the failures or the shortcomings, even though certainly, maybe I wasn't being held accountable from it by the guys on the ground because they understood. I still felt it and put that pressure on myself.
So you get out of Iraq, and then how long is it before you get to your first deployment in Afghanistan?
So I got back home to Texas. I was home for about 8 months. Went to my advanced course in Arizona for 6 months, and I got on the ground in late June of 2006 in Fort Bragg, and I was gone 6 weeks later. So early August of 2006 is when I pushed out to a very different way. It was a 3-week journey when I was with the conventional forces. This time here, we flew directly on a C-17 from Fort Bragg to Germany right into Kandahar.
Isn't that beautiful?
So less than 24. Yeah, it was beautiful. Less than 24 hours. Less than 24 hours later, I was in Kandahar in theater doing intel work to prepare our units, and that was a very big difference. But
yeah,
so I was there from August until August 06 to April of 07, and that was quite the deployment where I immediately had to establish rapport and credibility with Green Berets, who are seasoned, battle hardened. They'd been to Afghanistan several times, most of them by now, and to try to help them to understand the lay of the land and how the insurgency was changing in southern Afghanistan with, Mullah Dadullah taking a larger leadership presence and inspiring the Taliban to fight harder and emptying the madrasas in Pakistan and pushing reinforcements in, and a lot of things has changed about the nature of the insurgency, the willingness to use a lot more suicide vehicle-borne IEDs and using more tactics that they saw were being successful in Iraq with the roadside bombs, so that the complexity of the insurgency changed significantly in Afghanistan between 04 and 06. And so my knowledge and my experience in Iraq actually helped me to better understand Afghanistan in many ways.
And it's interesting. We have that in common. My first deployment also, I was attached to 5th and 10th Special Forces Group. I was there for 3 different battalions through the SF because I was there for like almost 15 months, and those guys rotate out at every 7 or 8 months. But it's an entirely different world. It's an entirely different level of pressure. It's an entirely different level of professionalism and competency from the people that you work with, who demand the very best out of everybody. And most people who aren't tabbed, who get brought into that environment, it's sink or swim very quickly. If you swim,
absolutely.
if you swim, they'll ask you to swim in deeper, harder, more turbulent waters. If you sink, they'll just leave you. And I don't say that in a pejorative way. It's just their focus is so laser refined that they don't have time to work with people and train them. They expect everybody to be at a certain level. I digress, but it just we share that kind of
totally
that understanding of walking into that environment. So that being said, one of the things I never deployed to Afghanistan. I did Iraq twice. So one of the things I'm always curious about when I talk to folks in Afghanistan who have been to both Afghanistan and Iraq, what were the biggest challenges? What was different? What stood out to you that was like? Because some people will tell you it was almost like an entirely different war.
Yep. Yeah, it was at times, I think, and other times it was very similar. But at the end of the day, it was always different because of the terrain. Iraq was a largely developed nation that was flat, that had a lot of roads, that had a lot of infrastructure, and Afghanistan was very primitive, very mountainous, a lot of desert, not a lot of roads, not a lot of hospitals or schools and all kinds of things like that. So very much more a third world nation in Afghanistan, which meant then, the people there had a different educational background. They were much more rural and farm and agricultural based. So, what you saw in Afghanistan was, you're really driven by the biggest difference in the insurgency was driven by the terrain and how the terrain channeled the insurgency's capacity to fight in the winter when it was really cold out. A lot of times the fighters pushed down from, further south or into Pakistan, so they didn't want to fight in the colder weather. So you had different fighting seasons. So there was a lot of differences that were really driven by the terrain. And then ultimately, the biggest thing in terms of the insurgency was the leadership and how difficult it was to organize, whereas in Iraq, they had very sophisticated ways of talking and coming together. And in Afghanistan, initially it was much more primitive, but because they had a lot of their leaders had seen a lot more combat over the years, and they were a lot more battle hardened. And therefore, they were able to, still be very effective without all the technology and without all, the effective meetings and shuras that you would often see in Iraq. Just it was made easier because it was a developed nation.
When you say the leaders, you're talking about the enemy combatant leadership, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. The leaders, the district commanders and, Mullah Omar and Dadullah and lots of the various leaders that were out there, again, they had to be very secretive in terms of how they met because they just didn't have the access to all the technology, to be able to come together like we often saw in the insurgency with Al Qaeda Iraq.
What was it like going after high-value targets? Like, how long was that process? And what was it like when you made the decision that, here's a HVT, as they call it, a high-value target, a guy that you're going to go after, and you feel like you have enough good information, and you send the unit out there? What's going through your mind as this whole thing is unfolding?
Yeah, well, the way, especially in terms of being a Special Forces Battalion, S2 works, is a big part of it is bottom up. So a lot of times the HVT process of going after high-value targets is often driven by their local reporting. So in many ways, they're the ones who know who they need to go after because they're the ones living there in that village or at that base. And so many times what we would just do is we corroborated and said, yeah, we can confirm that there's definitely meetings taking place in this area based upon our reporting that we're getting down here, but you guys know better than us because they're the ones who live in that area. And that's one of the great things about Special Forces, that they work so well with the indigenous people and the indigenous forces. So, with that, it was really driven from the ground up, and we refined it and confirmed it before, the battalion commander would then approve the assets and say go. But ultimately, they're the ones who typically made the decisions and made the strong recommendations on, making the call about who to go after, because they knew who they needed to go after and why, because they were, they needed to save their own lives, by going after some of those high value targets.
When your guys went on a raid, we see so much in movies that, there's a way for you to watch or keep up with it and listen in on the radio. Did you ever have that experience, and what was it like?
Oh, yeah, for sure. I mean, the biggest thing was in Afghanistan in what was called Operation Medusa in August of 2006. It was not just a raid, it was a series, of major movements to contact to really free, a couple of key areas outside of Kandahar city. So, I was, listening in on the radio the entire time. And then in some cases I actually went out there and flew out there with the battalion commander on the ground. And I, was there and I actually was there next to the JTAC that they were calling in Spectre gunfire that night.
Oh, wow.
Taking out targets that were, that I had identified through a lot of reporting that were locations where they were reinforcing because they wanted to make sure they maintained control of that terrain, which is very valuable to the Taliban. So, yeah, so it was one of those things where we really, to be able to experience it that close for me was a game-changing moment because it gave me the experience of realizing what those guys are going through and just how important it was that they were able to isolate and, to attrit the enemy forces when they were massing like they were.
You mentioned earlier about a call in Afghanistan that you had gotten wrong or it didn't go well. What was that specific instance you were talking about?
Yeah, so up in the Uruzgan province in February of 2000 and that was on the next deployment on February 2009. There was a couple of villages up there that seemed like there was very little enemy activity, that it was quiet. And when we got there, there was a couple of big attacks, small arms fire, very accurate sniper fire that killed one of our soldiers. And then there was a big IED attack that killed 3 of our soldiers and our interpreter and wounded another soldier from the unit. So they were from the same location within 8 days or 9 days apart. And there was really no, very limited indication from what I saw from the reporting that the enemy was consolidating power that far north into Uruzgan, but turns out they were, and they were very effective, with their IEDs and with their small arms.
So what was that like for you, man? What was it like trying to go to sleep that night?
Yeah, that was really tough, because I had thought, for sure that there was not a lot of potential that the enemy was going to be very strong there. And obviously, when, you lose soldiers from your unit, let alone, 4 of them within, an 8-day period. This is early in the deployment too. This is 5 weeks into the deployment. And typically this is not the fighting season. The fighting season that far north in Uruzgan usually is April, after the poppy grows. And for it to have taken place in middle of February was really alarming. And obviously, it hit our whole unit hard, but certainly hit me really hard. The story actually, goes is that team leader for that unit is actually became the first employee and the executive director for Team Red, White, and Blue, Blaine Smith, who really led our organization, starting in 2013, for 5 years. And, he was that team leader on the ground, who did an incredible job, given the situation and the circumstances that he found himself in. But that was definitely tough. And it's still, and him and I talked about, years later, that it was still something that was tough for me to process, knowing that, I had kind of painted a rather, non-threatening picture of where they were going, and certainly wish that I had been a little more paranoid, about why it was so quiet, and actually that it was quiet because they were planning.
Is it fair to characterize it as regret?
Yeah, I think that's fair. When you think about, like how you define regret, that I wish I had done it differently. So yeah, I think so. And again, even all these years later, you always sort of second guess yourself and wonder what could you have done differently, or, and what difference would it have made if I had painted a different picture? And I don't know, and, nor will I ever know, but certainly, there's obviously those emotions of regret that I still have. And I think that most people who have ever been responsible in one way, shape, or form for the loss of someone's life, that feeling sort of never, ever truly fades, over time.
All right, so your deployment cycle ends. You do 3 of them, and you come up with this idea for Team RWB. How does that whole thing happen?
So when I came out of Afghanistan in July of 2009, I immediately transitioned to Ann Arbor, Michigan, a state with no active duty military bases. And I was a fish out of water for sure. I was going through graduate school with people who had very different life experiences and very different thoughts and opinions than I did. And, there just wasn't much of a military presence there. And so I certainly struggled myself. And I thought through various ways that I could, try to give back and try to serve, because, staying busy at least gave me something, that I felt like I was making a positive difference. And, I really didn't find any ways to connect with veterans, especially those who were post 9/11 veterans, in Ann Arbor. And so I went out one day, I went to the VA hospital and just sort of said, hey, I'm kind of kicking around this idea of, starting a nonprofit. We might run and do triathlons and CrossFit and use those events to raise money to support veterans. What would that look like? Is there a need? Is there an unmet need? And so I met with the counselor, a woman named Jennifer Lohr, who was the counselor for all the post 9/11 vets from, the area of Michigan that were coming down to her VA hospital. And she said, hey, what they really need? Veterans really need just someone to have coffee with, someone to talk to. A lot of times they come back and they don't feel like anyone knows them. And because of that, they just really struggle to get to meet new people. And so the initial idea of Team Red, White, and Blue was, hey, we're going to do physical activity to raise money and raise awareness to support wounded veterans. And then what we're going to do is we're going to try to connect with veterans through the VA hospital who are struggling and try to build relationships with them. And so the initial idea of Team Red, White, and Blue is that we were going to try to partner with 10 wounded veterans per year and build relationships with them. And that was the initial idea. Really, that morphed. That morphed over the next year, where the focus really became, to now actually use the fitness that we were using to raise money and raise awareness, to use that physical fitness actually as the vehicle to help veterans, to connect with other people from the community. And so it no longer became just about wounded veterans. It no longer became, about just partnering with 10 wounded veterans per year, but it really became about building communities across America where veterans would have a chance to connect with other veterans, whether or not they identified as being wounded or as having PTSD or not. And then not only to connect with them, but then also to connect with other, fellow veterans, and also, with civilians in their community. And turns out it was a really powerful idea because a lot of veterans were looking for that. And they were also looking for a way to stay physically active. And so in many ways, Team Red, White, and Blue is known as being, the PT guys. We're the physical fitness group, and we're the ones who encourage veterans to run and to CrossFit and do yoga. But really, at the end of the day, what Team Red, White, and Blue is about is we're about forging relationships and helping veterans to meet new people in their community. And it just so happens to be that we do that very effectively through physical fitness. Because as you know from the military, when you have shared hardship together, that is the psychological proving ground for building good relationships with people, because you have to encourage each other. You got to encourage one another to stick with it. You have to support each other. And that's what we found in Team Red, White, and Blue, is what started out as, hey, let's run and do fitness to raise money. It actually became the vehicle that we used to help veterans, to connect with each other and to connect with other people, on top of being physically active and physically healthy. So in many ways, people who go and get involved in Team Red, White, and Blue, it's a real win-win situation. They're getting physically more healthy, but they're also getting, the opportunity to grow their relationships in their community.
We've had a bunch of different people who have started veterans groups on the podcast. Paul Rykoff from IAVA, Jason Van Camp from Mission 60. So there are a lot of veterans organizations out there. One of the things I think that's unique about RWB that other veterans organizations don't have is that you allow non-vets to take part in these events. It's that you are actually welcoming in anybody, because people are always asking, well, how do I help out vets? How do I help out vets? Well, you can sign up for RWB if you're not a vet. You can get your T-shirt, and you can go run with a vet and go have coffee with a vet, and just sit down and talk to a vet.
Absolutely.
Because, as you just said before, that's what a lot of us need. But was that something that was initially part of the design, or it just morphed into that?
Yes, and that's because that VA counselor, Jennifer Lohr, said, look, it doesn't need to be another veteran. It can be somebody who just wants to sit down, have a cup of coffee, or talk and share that experience. And then if you start thinking about it, so there's 22 million living veterans. Well, then there's also spouses, and then there's children. And then think of all the people who are directly related and or know somebody who is served. And when you started thinking about it, it's like, why are we closing out the opportunity for them to make a difference in a veteran's life? And we know that, all it takes sometimes is just one positive relationship in a person's life that can really turn it around. And so, our mindset is, veterans don't get out of the military and go live in a commune. They get out of the military and they interact with other people who have served and who have not served. Right. And I think it's really dangerous to sit there and for veterans to think that the only people who can understand their experiences are other veterans. So while no doubt, there's something unique about combat, and there's something unique about, the trauma that, a lot of people have experienced, there's also lots of other people who've experienced other, trauma and other tremendous adversity in their life, whether it's the loss of family members, car accidents, abuse. There's a lot of people out there who you might not understand exactly what veterans are going through, but they can understand, and they're willing to, and even if they have never been through anything traumatic in their life, they can lend an ear, and they can be supportive and be there to lift somebody up. And so that's really been, since the very beginning, has been part of our mindset, is how can we help people, how can we help veterans by not just connecting them to other veterans, but to anybody who wants to be supportive of them and who wants to be someone to listen to them and to share their story.
You've got over 42,000 members right now, or it may even be bigger than that. At least that's the last count I saw when looking online. But, how does this continue to grow for you guys?
So right now we're 238 chapters and 127,000 members strong.
Yeah, that was way off.
We are, so no, it's good. So that's good. I'm glad that the growth has been that high. It's just been tremendous. It's been very steady. And we really, we've built a solid business plan. Our staff has done a great job at implementing that plan with discipline. We have built some great partnerships with foundations, like the Bernie Marcus Foundation, Howard Schultz Foundation, the Ron Conway Foundation, but then also companies, like Microsoft and Walmart and Nike. So we built, some partnerships with some of the biggest brands and the biggest foundations that exist out there. And they really get what we're doing. And they see that we're not just helping veterans be more physically active, we're helping them to be more connected, and we're helping them to achieve better mental health, and we're reducing suicide, and we're improving, just so many, we're having all these various effects on the veteran community wherever we're at. And funders are really saying, wow, I get it. And this is also sustainable because we don't, have a lot of overhead. We've got 32 full-time staff right now. But we really work to be as lean of an organization as we can, because relationships and PT is free.
Right,
it's an effort to get people to commit their time and to say, hey, I'll go for a run with you, or I'll go to the gym with you. But what we do doesn't really cost money. It's just all the administration and everything that requires staff to be able to pull it all together to make it legal and to make it as effective as possible. But ultimately, what we've got is, I don't want to say we're infinitely scalable, but, as long as the funding is there and we can continue to grow and manage our growth effectively, we should become, at some point in the next 10 to 15 years, 1 million members strong, and, and be in every population center of 100,000 people or more. I think that's over like 650 places across America right now. So there's no reason why we shouldn't be in all those locations, and why, we shouldn't, be at least 1 million members, in that, whatever, 10, 12, 15 years from now.
It's amazing. Just the growth is unreal. I wish you guys nothing but the best. I've asked this question to other veterans organizations folks, and I'm curious to get your thoughts on it. Since I've started this podcast, and as I said, I've run into different people who all have a veterans organization, and I begin to wonder, even this podcast to a certain extent, is a veterans organization, if you will, in its own form. But I've always wondered, like, we're all after the same piece of the pie, and we're all kind of going for the same goal. And part of me feels like if we all just kind of join forces, almost like a Voltron. Like, remember Voltron growing up? If we all just joined together, we would be a much stronger, or one huge veterans organization that we could all benefit from. I always wondered why those discussions aren't happening, but is that something you think that sounds too crazy, or what's the reason for all the different groups?
No, I think it does. I think the conversation, certainly the conversation has been happening over the past, in the past 5 years or so. I think at the end of the day, though, this is America, and America, different people have different passions, and they have different talents, and they want to leverage those talents and passions in a way that they feel is the most effective. So you got some people out there who've got small nonprofits that bring veterans fishing and help veterans, learn how to farm. And there's people out there who, like Team Rubicon, that does veteran disaster response. And there's all kinds of different missions. But I think that people are so eclectic and they're so different that it would be really hard to build an organization that was a one-stop shop, and that, just come here and we do everything, right? We take you hunting, we take you, to learn how to farm. We take, I think so. It's very difficult to do that. And that's just part of, I think, the freedom that sits at the bedrock of America, is that people ultimately want to do what they're passionate about and what they think is super important, for veterans. And there's no doubt it could be much more efficient if we were able to pull together both the funding and the organization and the program management. But I just think that, that's why people start non-governmental organizations, to sort of fill in those gaps that, that government, can't address effectively. So, I do think that you'll see over the time mergers, if you will, mergers and acquisitions. Some nonprofits, I think a lot of them actually have started to close up shop, or, move their members to a different location, or encourage them to join a different, organization. I think there has been more of that. But ultimately, I think you're always going to see a bunch of different organizations, because the world today, allows people to do that, to create organizations, build a Facebook page, get the word out, start doing stuff. And I do think, though, that you're right, ultimately, that we need to continue figuring out how to cooperate and work together as effectively as we can to achieve the greatest effect for the veteran community.
So someone who wants to get involved in RWB, whether they're a vet or not, what do they do? How do they go about the process? Let everybody know.
Just go to teamrwb.org and click join the team. You can choose the local chapter nearest to you. There's a whole bunch of them. The list is quite long now of the one you can join. If there's not a chapter near you, you can still join the team. You can order your Nike-made Team Red, White, and Blue Eagle shirt. You pay like $5 for shipping, and that's it. Nike's donated the shirt, so you get a nice shirt for free. And then we encourage people to go out there and to represent Team Red, White, and Blue with pride, and to encourage people to tell other veterans, tell other people who know veterans, that they should consider joining Team Red, White, and Blue. And so there's all kinds of ways that people can get involved, even if it's not in their immediate chapter or where they meet, directly where they live.
When you look back at RWB from where it was to where it is now, how surprised are you?
I tell you, certainly, when I think about it in the first year, I'm shocked, because the vision was small. It was to, just help 10 wounded veterans per year. And, over time, I'm not shocked with where we've grown, because, after that, that first year, when we were thinking very small, we realized that we were onto something, that we had a strong brand, that we had a powerful idea, and then we got some incredible pro bono consulting support from the world's leading consulting firms. And they really helped us to think through, how can we scale this over the next 5 years? And so we're in year 5 of that 5-year business plan. And really, in many ways, we have been able to apply business acumen in our strategy that was developed. in 2012, to allow us to achieve, what we have in terms of our growth and in terms of the veterans that we're serving. So, but at the end of the day, from the very beginning, it's night and day. But from after we realized that we had something, we've really just applied, good business acumen, hired the right executive director who's built out a staff and hired the right people, and, really built the culture of the organization. And that's why we're continuing to grow.
Mike, it's just absolutely amazing. RWB is a fantastic organization. It's reaching to every corner of the country, and what you've done and what you've started and the firestorm you've created is helping veterans every single day. You know it and I know it. And listen, I know you're still putting a uniform on in a reserve capacity, so I continue to wish you luck and great service going forward. But most of all, as a fellow service member and a vet, just thank you for all that you've done. And certainly thank you for being part of this podcast, and nothing but continued success for you and RWB in the future.
Well, thank you very much. That means a lot. It's been a real honor to share some thoughts about my own personal journey, but more importantly, the journey of Team Red, White, and Blue, and to hopefully reach more veterans, through the podcast here, and have them join Team Red, White, and Blue, and hopefully enrich their lives as we have for so many others. So I really appreciate the opportunity, and look forward to continuing to listen and hear from more guests.
Mike Erwin, thanks for being part of the Hazard Ground podcast.
Thank you so much.
You've been listening to the Hazard Ground podcast, hosted by Mark Zeno and produced by Matt Pasquarella. If you have an interesting story to tell and you'd like to be on the show, send us an email at hazardgroundpodcast@gmail.com. And if you like the show, don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review on iTunes. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.